In this video, I'll be explaining how to rebuild the brakes on your 1990 Suzuki Katana. There's a few different variations involved with different models of the same bike. So if you have I believe it's 1989 to 98, you have the same bike, but a few of the parts are going to be slightly different. My model is a Model L. The best way you can find out which model bike you have is you look at your VIN number. The 10th digit in the VIN number is going to be which model you have. So mine is L, there's K, M, P, and I think like 3 or 4 others. So you want to find that out before you start ordering parts. So first of all, I have to apologize for already having everything completely apart. I wasn't able to record disassembling everything because I'm at an apartment complex right now, and it's kind of hard to do stuff when you don't have all your amazing tools. But I'll be showing a video of how to disassemble the pistons inside of all your calipers, actually how to pull them out. I'm also going to note that I'm not actually replacing my brake discs. If you're able to do all this, you should be able to do your brake discs just fine. But another thing is I have also already reassembled the rear brake cylinder. The piston cup set inside of it, I've already replaced it. However, on the front one, I have not replaced it, and it is fundamentally the same process. Over here is the old replacement parts for the rear, and this is the front one actually, and the whole reason I'm rebuilding the brakes right now. As you can see right about there, you can see that cut inside of the that piece of rubber. This is why my brakes completely gave out, that little cut. I'm also swapping over to stainless. I'll put a little description right here of the brand I'm using, and as I'm assembling everything, I'll mention some of the problems and complications when you go aftermarket. All right, let's get started. So first we're going to start with the actual calipers. You'll notice that I already have everything reassembled. The pistons are all in, and I have already replaced the rubber seals inside of here. There are 2 rubber seals for each piston. The same goes for the rear calipers as well. There's also these 2 right over here. They go in between here and right over here. You'll want to replace all of them because it is a huge pain to do, and you don't want to eventually have a brake leak later on and be like, oh, now I have to completely take apart everything just to redo this again. Yeah. So the video I just showed is me actually splitting the pistons from the caliper. Literally just blow air through it and try to cover up the holes that you can. And I strongly recommend you use some thin piece of metal that's strong enough, put it in between the calipers, and as you blow the air in, it's not going to completely blow out the piston. It's also important to note, when you blow out the piston, it comes out at a lot of force. If you hit something, you're going to break something. So be very careful when you're blowing out your pistons. Now that that's taken care of, put your pistons back in, squeeze them in. I used a vise and did it very slowly, just so you don't accidentally damage the brand new seals that you're replacing. And after that, it should look just like this. Now is where things start to get a little frustrating for me because I don't have a vise on this table. What you're going to want to do is start assembling your brake calipers. So the first thing I'm going to do, it doesn't have to be in this exact order, but I'm going to be placing the brake pads inside of the caliper. Technically you can do this later. I'm just going to do it now because I feel like doing it. But I'm going to make sure I have the side with the clips pointing to the side with the visible holes in it, just so it blocks it from falling out. Now that this is good to go, I'm going to be putting these little rubber pieces right on top of here on both sides. I also very, very strongly recommend you thoroughly clean your brake calipers. Debris starts to build up over time inside of it. I actually ran all of mine through a ultrasonic cleaner, which essentially just vibrates, and it uses a liquid to clean it as well. Very, very good way to clean it. But use air compressor or something like this, a pick in addition, to help remove any of the harder debris. You really don't want anything stuck inside your brake system. The lines, these are very, very thin lines. Debris can build up and it can really damage your braking ability. I also suspect this piece over here might have broken because something might have gotten stuck inside the brake system and damaged it. So be very, very careful. You want everything to be completely clean. Now what I'm going to do is install this side right on top of here. And this is where what I'm doing is going to probably slightly differ from what you're doing. What you want to do is when you're actually tightening these bolts down, you want to put Loctite on them and you want to torque them down really, really tight. If they start to back out over time, which has happened to me actually, funny enough, in the past, and I had a very small brake leak, then obviously you're going to have massive problems. So what I'm going to be doing for now is I'm going to be assembling it, putting these on just tight enough to where these rubber grommets aren't going to fall out. And later I'm going to put it on the bike and then do the final torque, because I can't torque them to spec without a vise or something to hold them in place right now. Now I'll be doing the exact same process, except on the rear caliper. There's also only one of these instead of two. Now that I have the brake calipers assembled, I just went outside to make sure that the gap is actually wide enough to where I can fairly comfortably put it back on the bike without having to take it apart and then squeeze the pistons over again. So just make sure you actually push your pistons in enough to where you can put it back on the bike. Now that I just fixed my chair to stop it from squeaking every time I moved a millimeter, let's start working on reassembling the front brake master cylinder. It is incredibly similar to the rear, but let's start on this and I'll point out any differences that you need to keep in mind on that one. For starters, you want inside of there to be perfectly clean. I'm actually going to be doing a little bit more work on that right now that I see a little bit of debris towards the end. You'll also notice some of that rust around the edge. I've done everything I can to get rid of it. Sure, I could do some more effort, but at the end of the day, I'm going to make sure none of that actually falls inside of the cylinder. But really make sure nothing ever falls in the cylinder. You're going to have the exact problem I had earlier. A little bit of noteworthy information about this is these two pieces of hardware over here. So I decided just to replace all the hardware on my bike just because these bolts are looking bad and the threads and some of them are really, really bad. So when I ordered a new one of these for it, which said it goes right here, you'll notice they do not look the same. The threads aren't even the same. I can't tell you why. It's supposed to be the same for all the models to my knowledge, but clearly it is not. So I ended up going online and I found a replacement one of these, and that's what I'm using now. Also, my original one, the threads were super messed up. But yeah, that's just a little piece of advice you're going to want to keep in mind if you're ordering new hardware. There are two different types of threads and bolts for it, so keep that in mind. Another thing is I actually already replaced this eye. It's actually made of plastic. I originally thought it would be glass, but the process of doing it is pretty straightforward. What I did was I used a screwdriver to knock the center of it out, and then once you're left with just the metal ring around it, I used the Dremel tool and I slowly pressed down until I could eventually have enough play to actually remove the metal around it. And once the metal is out, then you just get the replacement one, put the O-ring in, and then just press in super, super hard your new eye. They're super cheap to get on Amazon. I'll put the measurements in the description right over here. So if you want to replace yours as well, you can as well. Once you're completely certain that everything inside of there is perfectly clean, you can start assembling everything over here. This is the first piece you're going to just pretty much just drop in and everything goes in this exact direction, you'll also want to make sure all of this is perfectly clean as well. Once you've dropped the piston and cup in, you're going to drop this circlip in. You want to push down slightly so you have it like a space in there to actually fit this inside of it. Now that you have the piston inside as well as that little clip holding it in, it's ready to move on to the next part, this little rubber piece. If for whatever reason you're putting this in and the piston does not want to actually move, I recommend you take this piece apart, reattach it on there, and actually squeeze it with the lever. It'll suddenly free it up real quick, and then afterwards you can just move this piston fairly easily, just like that. With this little rubber piece, this top circle, the very small one, is where it'll line up around the piston right over there. Now I have mine on real nice and clean. You'll want to make sure that when you're installing it, the bottom part goes all the way down and the top fits real smooth around the piston. You'll notice that small little hole, there it is, in the bottom right below the piston. I'm considering whether I want to put a set screw in there just to clog up that hole, but I'm not quite sure if I want to just yet. But when you're installing this, whatever you do, make sure you don't put any holes in the rubber or at all, because that would completely defeat the whole point of it. Now the next step, I'll be throwing this little switch right over here. I strongly recommend that you replace any of the hardware that you have on your bike with stainless. I've already done it with like 99% of my bike, including these parts right here actually. Now the next step I'll be taking is putting the handlebar back on it. These are also stainless and replaced, and funny enough, I actually replaced this piece right over here. It's a huge pain to actually replace it, and I ended up taking a Dremel, cutting 4 little slots in it, and then trying to push it in and just replace it essentially and put a new one in. But I wouldn't recommend you do that. As you can see, mine does not look good. Mine is strong enough to hold it on, I think, forever, but at the same time, if you make a little mistake, I just wouldn't recommend doing it. Now the next step is reinstalling this little piece right on the left side over here. Now the next step, kind of optional if you want to do it right now, I just put this in to kind of just block up the hole for now, and then I'm going to install this. Make sure that this rubber piece over here is clean. Potentially replace it, because you do not want any leaks in your brake system anywhere. These are also stainless as well. Now I've already rebuilt this, but I'll explain the process of how to do it. First thing you want to do is loosen this nut, and then you're going to want to remove this entire upper section by loosening it, and it'll take this nut off with it. After you have that off, you're pretty much almost there. Now you want to remove this rubber piece from this nut right up here, pull that nut out, and then you're going to want to remove this rubber. So once you've removed this rubber piece, you'll be left with this mechanism. It has the threads on it. At the very end, it has a washer, and it's kind of rounded at the end where it presses into this. What's going to happen is the first thing you're going to want to do is remove the circlip. After the circlip's out, this entire mechanism can just kind of fall out with it, and you'll want to clean that rounded washer on the end, make sure it's not completely covered in rust like mine was. And then after that, this mechanism can just come out nice and easy. I recommend replacing it if you're gonna end up working on it for whatever reason. It's just replace it now so you don't have to in the future. And the reassembly is pretty straightforward. Reinsert this mechanism. After this is installed, then you're going to want to use this internal piece with the threads on it, push into it with the washer still attached, and once the washer is far enough down, you can then insert a new circlip, and then that's the bulk of it. Once you have that washer in, you can then drop this piece of rubber all the way down in there, and then once the rubber piece is on, you tighten this piece down, and then after that, you're going to want to bring this onto it as well, and then you're going to bring this top section back on, and then retighten this piece up just to hold this top section together. When it comes to reassembling both of these, The worst part is that little circlip. Personally, all I ended up using was this little flathead screwdriver and this much bigger flathead screwdriver. I didn't use any extra tools to install them. That was literally it. Now for the next step, I'll be reinstalling this piece with the new hose onto the rear master cylinder. It's fairly easy to do. All you have to do is put this O-ring on there, and then afterwards you're going to push this piece back in place, and I strongly recommend, now that you have it apart, replace this with stainless because it is a huge pain to access normally. Now I've installed the entire mechanism, and you'll notice I do not have the original clamps on here. I like stainless parts, so I swapped over to stainless. Now the next step I'm taking is I just cleaned this up. This looks real nice and clean. Put that on there, reassemble the whole thing, and these are also stainless. So the next step I'm taking is on the front calipers. You'll notice these areas right over here. What you should do is remove these, completely clean everything on there, and I recommend you replace the washer if you can. It is also recommended in general that you replace these. They're fairly expensive, so I'm not saying you have to replace it. I'm not personally replacing it right now, but it's just something I've seen recommended quite a lot. Now the next step is I'll be describing the entire brake line system. As you can tell, these are nice stainless and new. These are possibly the original 1990 brake lines, so definitely replacing them. It's about time. But one big distinction you'll notice from this and these original ones is if you look at the width over here. When you're comparing the width side by side, you'll notice the original are actually ever so slightly wider. This is a little bit annoying when you're actually reassembling the entire thing, and I'll show you why. Typically, when you're reassembling your brake lines, you'll want to make sure this hole over here actually lines up with the hole in this. That, however, is not as easy when you're changing to aftermarket brake lines that are slightly thinner up here. So you'll notice inside of here, it does have that little groove, which makes it much easier so you don't have to have it perfectly lined up. And you'll notice in here that the width actually gets a little thinner, so it doesn't have to be perfectly lined up as well, which is incredibly helpful. You'll notice I put these red marks on top of mine, which line up perfectly with the holes. So that's when I'm reassembling it, I can try to get it as close as possible. Not always perfect, but at the end of the day, I hope it works okay when I'm fully assembled. Another aspect is because they're thinner, you're also not going to be able to just use one washer in every single position. So I'll be noting whenever I'm fully reassembling this, how many washers I have in which positions. So maybe you can recreate yours by doing what I'm doing, but it's also very possible you're going to have to do slightly different washer setups. Now I'm back to working on the bike, and I'm in a parking lot. So the first thing I'm going to do is tighten this down over here. You can see I have two washers on top, one on the bottom. That's just because I'm using aftermarket brake lines and everything doesn't want to fit perfectly. So tighten that down, and then you're going to want to route that hose through right over here, this piece. So the next step is right behind here, which I already did. This pin right over here attaches through here, and then I have something holding it in place right over here with that little washer also on this side. Now in this step, what I'm going to do is just attach the actual cylinder into the frame of the bike. These are also stainless, which I recommend you do as well. So the next step I just completed was I put the actual caliper on. When you're installing the caliper, first you want to remove this piece over here where you normally bleed the brakes from. Next, you're going to try to force it on, and I just used a hammer to lightly tap it in slowly just to force it on. After that, I just put this bolt and this bolt right over here on. I didn't torque them down yet, but I will be doing that soon. What I'm going to do now is for this bolt right here and this bolt over here that I just put kind of snug on earlier, now I can torque it down because it's being held in place real good. So I've just installed this bolt, and you can actually see a little bit of that Loctite coming out. What you want is it to be about 20 to 23 foot-pounds according to the book. Personally, I just went to 23, it felt a little loose to me, so I went a little bit more. However, this one over here, I wasn't able to actually fit my torque wrench in just because this exhaust is in the way. So I just used a normal wrench, and it's more than tight enough. Now I'm going to come from up top, and I'm going to remove this over here. And now I have just reinstalled this upper bar. And to do so, I actually had to remove these two bolts, which is why I didn't tighten them down super hard last time. So now that this is reattached over here, you'll notice the castle nut back here had that clip in it. You don't want it to be stupid tight because it does have to move freely a little bit as the suspension goes up and down. You just really want the pin to be holding it in place at the end of the day. So now what I'm going to be doing is lining this up with these right over here. Now I'm going to actually attach the brake line to the caliper itself. For me, I have two washers over here and one on the left side. I didn't mention it earlier, but I already put this piece back in, and the last thing I'm going to be doing over here is just throwing this on. Now my next step is going to be reattach this piece right here, right over here. Now that she's attached, I'm just going to cut this over here so she lines up properly. So I was rushing through it just now, and I accidentally cut it just barely too short, so I'm gonna have to replace that. But essentially just tighten it and you're good to go in that regard. After that's all complete, you want to throw this right over here, the actual foot peg mechanism on. And after that, you want to throw this piece right over here on. This little 8mm can be really annoying. Do not over tighten it. You do not want to mess up the threads inside of there. So now I'm going to switch from the back over to the front, and I'm going to be installing this piece right over here. Now on the front end, you want to make sure you tighten down and torque these bolts that hold the caliper together before you install it, because obviously you can't access it unless it's on the other side. So I torqued them down already, and those are good to go. Put Loctite in as well. I just put these two in as well, and also put Loctite on them. The same with the ones in the back. Now on this side, you'll want to do the exact same thing, and also just throw this on. Now we're almost done. So what I just did was attach the cables over here with this bolt right over here. As you can see, mine is a little bit different than normal because my threads were really messed up, but just attach the piece up here and you're good to go. And you'll see my washers. I have one over here, two over here, and then back behind that I have one. I have one over here and one over here. Now the next step is to actually attach the brake line to the caliper itself. You'll notice this piece and this piece are both 14mm in this case. Since I didn't have two 14mm wrenches, I just used this. So now on this side, you'll want to do the exact same thing, tighten them all down. And I have this extra cable running because that's just how my speedometer works. And I'm going to be zip tying it along here just so it stays out of the way. So now I've just reattached the brake reservoir up here. Nice new stainless as well. Now the final step when it comes to reassembling everything, you just kind of want to have to throw this right over here. Up here I just have one washer on this side and one over here, and don't forget to attach these wires. So I just threw this hose on, and now everything's done hardware wise. Everything's installed. So now the last step is you're going to want to go over every brake line where everything meets. You're going to want to make sure the holes are properly aligned so that the brake fluid can actually go through and then go to the next point. I'm going to have to double check a few of them, but this one over here, obviously I can't check anymore, so I did this one well in advance. The very next step is what you're going to want to do is line up the banjo bolts with the individual brake lines. So you can see right here I have a black mark. This indicates where the hole in the bolt is so that I can actually have it lined up properly with the brake line. Now we're on to the most annoying step, actually adding brake fluid to the entire system. Now I've already done this, but I'm going to put a link in the description If you watch the video in the description, it'll show you how to do every step, and I'd highly recommend it. A very simple rundown of how you're going to want to add brake fluid to the system is first you're going to want to remove the cap over here, fill it up with brake fluid, and on a side note, this piece right over here, you'd want to jiggle it around and make sure all the air actually comes out of it. So after you have a whole lot of brake fluid in there, you're going to move to the back over here. And on the rear, there's only one of these. You're going to use an 8mm to loosen and tighten it. First, you're going to want to loosen it, and then while it's loose, you press down on the brake lever, pushing the piston all the way forward, which will push air out of the system. Then, while you're still holding this down, you want to tighten it back up. Once that happens, it's actually going to suck some of the fluid from up top down into the system, and then you're going to just repeat that step over and over again. Loosen, push and hold down, tighten, release, and then more fluid comes in. You're going to also want to make sure that at all times you have a lot of fluid in the brake reservoir. If for whatever reason you don't pay attention and suddenly you start sucking air into the system, you're going to have to do this all over again for much longer to push all of that extra air out of the system. So constantly watch the brake level and keep adding fluid over and over. Now, as you can see, I've removed pretty much everything over here, and I'm going to be adjusting this mechanism right here. From the videos earlier, you could see that mine was actually more forward. What I'm going to be doing now is pulling it backwards. This is because when earlier I was riding it, I pushed all the way down on the brakes. What happened was I couldn't actually lock up the wheel and just give it real braking power. What you want to do is pull this entire mechanism further back so that when you do push on the brake doesn't actually bottom out before you're applying full pressure. Now, this next step is very easy but very important. You want your brake light to actually go on. So when I press the pedal, it actually activates. How you're going to do this is inside of there, you can see this rubber piece right back there. All you have to do is turn it by hand, and that'll adjust the sensitivity so that right when you slightly touch it or at whatever point, it'll activate the brake light. So don't forget to adjust that. On the front of the bike, it's the exact same process of adding brake fluid. The only distinction is that you have two calipers, and on both calipers, you have both of these points where you want to actually bleed the air. I like to do it the furthest point in the system first, so all the way over here, and then after that, I'll go over here. And you want to do it for both sides and go back and forth over and over and over again until you're 100% certain there is zero air left in the entire brake system. These pieces also came with my aftermarket brake lines. I'm not really sure what they are or how to use them. If anyone knows what they are or how to use them, put them in the comments because I'm very curious. For the last part of the video, I'll be showing all of the torques for all the different parts of the bike. And as usual, if there are any corrections, I will have them in the description below. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment.